Greetings to all and welcome to Fireside Story. Today we tell you the story of a victory that on paper was impossible. The year is 722. Almost all of Hispania is under the control of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Visigothic kingdom, which once dominated the peninsula, has been annihilated in less than a decade. The surrender seems total, but in a forgotten corner of the mountains of Asturias, one man refuses to kneel. A nobleman named Pelayo. How could a handful of rebels challenge an empire at its peak? Was it a real battle or a skirmish that legend turned into myth? This is the story of the victory that ignited the flame of the Reconquista. Let's begin with today's story. To understand how an empire collapses, sometimes you don't have to look at the walls, but the hallways of the palace. In the year 711, the Visigothic kingdom of Toledo seemed invulnerable, but inside, it was completely rotten. King Witiza had just died, and with him, what little stability remained. The Visigothic monarchy had a fundamental design problem. It was not strictly hereditary. Every time a king died, the most powerful nobles would meet to elect the next one. Imagine a board of shareholders deciding on the new CEO, but with swords and conspiracies. This created two irreconcilable factions. On one side, there were the sons and supporters of the late Witiza, the so-called Witizans. They believed that the throne belonged to them by right and lineage. But the rival nobility had other plans. In a turbulent assembly, they ignored the heirs and chose their own champion, a powerful and respected duke on the battlefield named Rodrigo. For half the kingdom, Rodrigo was not a legitimate king. He was a usurper. Civil war was inevitable. The Witizens, politically defeated and furious, made a decision that would change history forever. They looked south, to the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar. There, the Muslim governor of North Africa had armies, ambition, and ships. They thought they were being clever. They would hire mercenaries for their cause. A small strike force to win a battle, overthrow Rodrigo, and reclaim what was theirs. What could go wrong? The request for help was accepted immediately, but the Witizens did not understand who they were opening the door to. They were not hiring a simple ally. They were inviting a force that had no intention of leaving after getting paid. The first act of the tragedy was written. The Visigothic civil war was about to become the conquest of an empire. In July 711, two worlds collided on the banks of the Guadalete River. King Rodrigo had gathered the flower of his armies, an imposing heavy and armored force. He was confident he would crush the invaders and, in the process, consolidate his throne once and for all. The chronicles of the time, which must sometimes be read with care, speak of some 33,000 Visigothic soldiers. Facing them, Tariq ibn Ziyad commanded a force of about 12,000 Berbers. On paper, Rodrigo's victory seemed inevitable. The battle began with a predictable fury. The clash of steel against steel resonated throughout the valley. The Visigothic center, led by the king himself, withstood the enemy's push with iron discipline. Victory seemed within reach. But then, what no one on Rodrigo's side expected occurred. The wings of his army, commanded precisely by the brothers of the late Witiza, halted. Some sources say they simply retreated. Others, that they defected to the enemy in the middle of combat. For the Visigothic army, it was the end. Suddenly, its powerful center was left completely exposed, attacked from the front, and now also from the flank. The battle line broke, order turned into panic, and panic into a desperate flight. In the midst of the chaos, King Rodrigo disappeared. He most likely died fighting, but his body was never found with certainty. An army without a general is a body without a head. The defeat turned into a massacre. The Battle of Guadalete was not just a defeat. It was the almost total annihilation of Visigothic military power in a single day. The army that was supposed to defend the kingdom had ceased to exist. The gates of Hispania were, literally, wide open. With the Visigothic army shattered, the path to the heart of Hispania was clear. Tariq ibn Ziyad was not a man who waited to be given permission. Instead of consolidating his position in the south, he did the unthinkable. He aimed directly for the head of the kingdom, Toledo. His advance was a lightning strike. Cities fell one after another, often with hardly any resistance. Cordoba was taken with incredible audacity. Shortly after, Toledo itself, the center of Visigothic power, fell almost without a fight. The ruling elite had fled, leaving a vacuum that the invaders filled. And if the situation was not bad enough, in 712 it got worse. Musa ibn Nusayr, Tariq's commander, landed in Algeciras with 18,000 reinforcements. This was no longer a raid. It was a large-scale conquest, organized and with enormous resources. But Musa did not go directly north, following his subordinate. He decided to secure the south and west with his powerful army. He took cities that had resisted, such as Seville and the formidable Merida, which withstood a very harsh siege. The conquest was now advancing on two fronts, like a pincer closing in on the peninsula. The reason why such a vast territory fell so quickly is not found in the sword alone. It is also found in the pen. The conquerors offered the local elites very clever surrender pacts. What could the Visigothic nobles do? The most famous case is the Pact of Theodemir. This Visigothic nobleman ruled the region of Mercia. The agreement was simple. He and his people could keep their lands, their Christian religion, and a notable autonomy. In exchange, they had to swear allegiance to the Umayyad Caliphate and pay an annual tax. It was an offer that was hard to refuse. For many, it was better to be a rich local lord under a new power than a corpse under the rubble. This strategy minimized resistance and greatly accelerated the conquest. Thanks to this mix of force and diplomacy, almost the entire peninsula was subdued in just a few years. The old Visigothic kingdom disappeared from the map. In its place, a new territory was born that would be known as Al-Andalus. While Al-Andalus was consolidating in the northern mountains, a name began to resonate like an echo of rebellion, Pelayo. But who exactly was this man who dared to challenge the inevitable? If we heed the chronicles written a century later, such as that of Alfonso III, the story is like something out of a movie. Pelayo was a pure-blooded Visigothic nobleman, nothing less than a Spatharius, a member of the personal guard of King Rodrigo himself, a loyalist who had survived the disaster and refused to surrender. Sounds good, doesn't it? The last guardian defending the honor of his fallen king. However, many modern historians wrinkle their noses at this version. They believe it is more likely that Pelayo was a local chieftain, an Asturian, or perhaps Cantabrian, chief who already had power and influence in the area long before the invasion. So I present him as a Visigothic super-noble. 9th century political marketing, directly linking Pelayo to the lost kingdom of Toledo, gave him enormous legitimacy. It turned him into the natural heir of the resistance, not just a mere regional rebel. What does seem clearer is his story right after the conquest. Pelayo was sent to Cordoba, the new capital, probably as a kind of hostage or ambassador, to negotiate the submission of the Asturians. But Pelayo was not a man for pacts. At some point, he fled from there and returned to his mountains. He was determined not to submit. And here lies the key to his success. Whether he was a high-born Visigoth or a local chief with good propaganda, Pelayo was the perfect figure. For the Visigothic nobles who had fled to the north, he was one of their own, an acceptable leader. For the Asturians and Cantabrians, he was a man who knew the terrain and his people. He was not just a warrior. He was the glue that could unite two worlds, the remnants of a defeated aristocracy and a mountain people who had never been easy to dominate. His first task would not be to fight, but to convince his own neighbors that rebellion was possible. Imagine a wall, not one made of stone and mortar, but of sharp peaks, impenetrable forests, and perpetual fog. This is the Cantabrian mountain range. While the rest of the peninsula submitted through pacts or by the sword, these mountains became the last fortress. For a regular army like that of the Umayyad Caliphate, this terrain was a logistical nightmare. Here there were no great plains to deploy their famous cavalry. There were no wide roads to move supplies. Every narrow valley was a potential ambush. Every gorge, a death trap. The climate was another relentless enemy. Rain and snow could isolate an army for weeks. How do you maintain a supply line through a labyrinth of mountains defended by people who know every cave and every path? You simply can't. For the power of Cordoba, pacifying Asturias was an extremely expensive military effort with almost no benefit. In this natural refuge, a curious mix of people began to congregate. On one hand, there were the locals, Assurers and Cantabrians, mountain peoples that neither the Romans nor the Visigoths had managed to completely dominate. They were tough, self-sufficient people with very little desire to pay taxes to anyone. They were joined by refugees arriving from the south, remnants of the Visigothic army, nobles who had lost their lands, and clerics fleeing with their relics. Some contributed knowledge of the terrain and an indomitable spirit. The others, the memory of a lost kingdom and a deep desire for revenge. The result was the creation of a territory outside the law of the Caliphate. It was not yet a kingdom, nor did it have a clear structure. It was a de facto independent zone, a place where the authority of Al-Andalus ended where the slopes began, a small island of resistance in an ocean of submission. Passive resistance does not last forever. There comes a time when hiding is not enough. Around the year 718, the leaders of the resistance, Visigothic nobles and local Asturian chiefs, held an assembly. Do not imagine a grand throne room. It was more of a clandestine meeting in some hidden valley, with the sound of the wind as the only background music. There they made a crucial decision. They needed a single command, a visible leader who would embody the rebellion. And the chosen man was Pelayo. They did not name him king, not yet. They gave him the title of princeps, which in practice meant being the military leader, the first among equals. With the leadership formalized came the first act of open defiance. Pelayo and his people refused to pay taxes. This was not a simple protest. It was a full-fledged declaration of insubordination. They refused to pay the jizya, the tax for not being a Muslim, and the jareh, the tribute for the land they worked. The news quickly reached the ears of the local authority, a Berber governor named Munuza, who was based in Gijon. For him, at first, this was an administrative problem. A few stubborn mountaineers who didn't want to pay. Nothing that couldn't be fixed with a little pressure. Munuza sent small patrols to convince them. The result was a series of skirmishes. They were not great battles, but rather quick and brutal ambushes in the mountain passes. In each confrontation, Pelayo's rebels proved that fighting in those mountains was very different from fighting in the open field. The governor began to worry. The tax insubordination was turning into an armed insurgency. The problem was no longer local, and his patience had run out. A message had to be sent to Cordoba. It had to be reported that the small ember in the north threatened to become a fire. But Munuza's problem was not only military. It was also, as often happens, a personal matter. The chronicles tell us a story that seems taken from a swashbuckling romance. The Berber governor had set his sights on Pelayo's sister, a woman named Ermesinda, and he wanted her for himself. Marrying the sister of a local leader was a classic tactic to forge alliances, or, in this case, to humiliate and neutralize him. So Munuza devised a plan that was as cunning as it was twisted. He sent Pelayo to Cordoba under a pretext, a supposed diplomatic mission to negotiate with the high spheres of Andalusian power. The idea was simple. While the protective brother was away, he would have a free hand to take Ermesinda as his wife, by fair means or foul. This brings up a question. Is this story completely true? The Christian chronicles adorn it with all the details of a drama of honor. Perhaps it was exactly like that, or perhaps it is a way to explain why the struggle became so fierce. What matters is that for those who told this story, the grievance was real and profound. But Munuza's plan had a fatal flaw. He underestimated Pelayo. As soon as the rebel leader sensed the trap, he did not wait to finish any negotiation. He fled from Cordoba and returned to his mountains at full speed, driven by a fury that went beyond politics. Munuza had made the worst possible mistake. Not only had he created a rebel, he had now given him a personal cause. It was no longer just about taxes or independence. It was about family honor. And for honor, in the 8th century, a man was capable of setting the world on fire. The rebellion had just found its emotional spark. In Cordoba, the news arriving from the north sounded more like a joke than a threat. The great Umayyad Caliphate, which stretched from India to the Atlantic, worried about a handful of mountaineers. It was absurd. The Arab chronicles of the time reflect this disdain. They referred to Pelayo's group as 30 wild donkeys. For the Central Power, that was not a rebellion, it was a public order problem. Some bandits who refused to pay taxes in a poor region with no strategic importance. But the reports from Governor Munuza were increasingly insistent. The small patrols were not working, and the defiance remained. And insubordination, however small, is like a disease. If not treated, it spreads. The Wali of Al-Andalus, Ambassa ibn Suhaim al-Kalbi, decided that enough was enough. He could not allow a corner of his territory to declare itself in rebellion with impunity. It was a matter of authority. So he ordered a punitive expedition to be prepared. It was not an army of conquest, but more like a large-scale police force. Its mission was not to occupy the territory, which they already considered theirs. The objective was much more concrete. Command of the operation was given to a general named Al-Qama. The orders were simple and direct. Go up into the mountains, crush the revolt, capture or kill Pelayo and his ringleaders, and restore the payment of taxes. A swift operation to teach an unforgettable lesson. For Al-Qama and his men, it was a routine mission, a dirty but necessary job. What they did not know was that they were about to enter a theater where the rules of war, as they knew them, were of no use. This is where history mixes with legend, especially when it comes to counting soldiers. If we read the Chronica Albaldens, written more than a century later, it tells us that Al-Qama marched with an army of 187,000 men. A figure, let's be honest, that is completely absurd. Sending almost 200,000 soldiers to solve a problem of unpaid taxes in a remote area would be like using a nuclear weapon to kill a fly. It was pure propaganda to aggrandize the future Christian victory. On the other hand, what did the Arab sources say? Well, almost nothing. Chroniclers like Al-Makari barely dedicate a few lines to the matter, treating it as a minor, unimportant incident. To them, it was a simple police operation, not a campaign worthy of being remembered. This leads to the obvious question: how many were there really? Modern historians, making calculations based on logistics and context, estimate a much more logical force. Probably a contingent of several thousand soldiers, perhaps between 5,000 and 10,000 men. Mind you, this does not take away a shred of merit from what was to come. An army of 5,000 veterans was still a terrifying and overwhelming force. It was more than enough to crush the approximately 300 warriors who, according to tradition, followed Pelayo. Furthermore, it was no ordinary army. It was composed of a mix of Berber troops, the shock infantry of the Conquest, and a corps of experienced Arab officers, men who had conquered an entire kingdom in less than a decade. This formidable force advanced with total confidence, venturing into the labyrinth of Asturian valleys. Its objective was clear: to find Pelayo and end the joke once and for all. Before ordering the assault, General Al-Qama decided to play one last card, a psychological card. Instead of sending a herald, he chose a man who spoke the same language and prayed to the same god as the rebels, a Visigothic bishop named Oppas. Oppas was the perfect symbol of collaboration. He was possibly the brother of the late King Witiza, which placed him on the side that had facilitated the entry of the Caliphate's armies. To him, Pelayo's resistance was not heroism, it was suicidal madness. The meeting took place on the mountainside. On one side, a prince of the church, backed by a formidable army. On the other, a rebel chieftain, with a handful of followers. According to the chronicles, Oppas tried to appeal to logic. He reminded Pelayo that the powerful Visigothic kingdom, with all its armies, had been annihilated. What hope could he have? He promised him that if he surrendered, he could keep his possessions and live in peace under the new power. Pelayo's response was direct and sharp. He did not trust the promises of a man who had betrayed his own people. And then he spoke the words that would define the spirit of the Reconquista. He professed to have no doubt that the salvation of his people would come from Christ through that very mountain, and that he would rather die there, free, than accept the chains of the Saracens. The negotiation had failed. Oppas returned to Al-Qama's camp empty-handed. The message was clear. Those mountaineers were not going to surrender. They would have to be removed from there by force. Diplomacy was over. Now the swords would speak. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. Pelayo did not have an army to win a battle. He had a map. His only real weapon was geography, and he chose it with surgical precision. The chosen place was the pass of Covadonga, whose ancient name was Cova Dominica, the Cave of the Lady. It is not a valley, it is a funnel, a corridor of rock and trees, barely a few hundred meters wide, flanked by almost vertical slopes. Here, the rules of war changed completely, and an army of thousands of men could not form a battlefront. It was forced to stretch out, to advance in a long, thin column, like a snake entering a crevice. Its numerical superiority was nullified. Only the soldiers of the vanguard could fight, while the rest of the army waited for its turn to die. And the cavalry, the most devastating weapon of the Caliphate's army, became completely useless. Horses cannot climb rocky slopes. Al-Qama's horsemen would have to fight on foot, like simple infantrymen, on terrain they did not know. Pelayo's plan was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. He was not going to face them head-on. He was going to let them in. He would allow the head of the column to advance deep into the pass. Meanwhile, his 300 men would be hidden in the heights, on both sides, waiting. And in the center of it all, the cave. That hollow in the mountain was not just a refuge. It was the command post, the last bastion, and a symbol. A natural sanctuary where the mountain itself seemed to protect the rebels. The battle would be won or lost in that kilometer of valley. Al-Qama and his men advanced, unaware that they were walking straight into the only battle they could not win. Al-Qama's army column entered the gorge with the arrogance of one who knows himself to be superior. The sound of thousands of boots and hooves echoed against the rock walls. For them, the only difficulty was the narrow terrain. There was no trace of the enemy. The silence of the wooded slopes was almost insulting. Above, among the trees and rocks, Pelayo's men held their breath. Each one was at his post, motionless, watching as the serpent of metal and leather moved deeper and deeper into the trap. There were no nerves, only a predatory patience. They had been preparing for such a moment their whole lives without knowing it. They knew every tree, every ledge. The valley was their home, and they were about to close the door on the intruders. Pelayo waited. He let the vanguard pass by. He let the main body of the troops, the officers, and Al-Qama himself be right below their positions. Only when the rear guard of the column entered the gorge did he give the signal. It was not a heroic war cry. It was something more primitive. The sound of a horn, sharp and piercing, that echoed throughout the valley. And then, hell was unleashed from the sky. It was not a charge. It was an avalanche. Hundreds of man-sized boulders, which had been painstakingly placed on the edge of the precipices, were hurled down upon the column. Sharpened logs fell like giant javelins, impaling several men at once. A rain of arrows and stones thrown with slings darkened the sun. The chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The vanguard could not retreat, blocked by their own comrades. The rear guard could not advance. The formation broke in an instant. The soldiers, trained to fight in an open field, did not know where the attack was coming from. They had no one to charge. They could only raise their shields and watch as death rained down on them from slopes that seemed empty. Al-Qama's army was trapped. From the bottom of the valley, the response of Al-Qama's army was a reflex act of desperation. The archers, with their necks forced at an impossible angle, tried to return fire. Thousands of arrows and javelins flew toward the slopes. They sought an enemy they could not see. And here, the Christian chronicles offer us a miracle. They tell that the arrows, upon striking the rock of the cave, turned around in the air and fell upon the very ones who had shot them. A divine punishment. The intervention of the Virgin, protecting her champions. A beautiful story, no doubt. But the military explanation is just as fascinating and much more probable. Put yourself in the shoes of an archer in that gorge. You are shooting almost vertically. Most of your arrows do not have the force to reach the summit. They simply stop in the air and fall back down. The ones that do make it ricochet against the rock wall at unpredictable angles, becoming projectiles for your own comrades. What do you do when your own arrows attack you? Panic turns into terror. The feeling of helplessness is absolute. Not only are you attacked from above, but the valley itself seems to return the death that you hurl at it. Psychologically, it was the coup de grace. For those soldiers, that was not a battle against men. It was a fight against the mountain itself, which seemed to have taken a side. There was no longer any tactic or discipline, only a primary instinct to get out of there however they could. The vanguard tried to force its way forward. The rearguard pushed backward to flee, and in the center, crushed between both movements, the men of Al-Qama died without having been able to lift a sword. The massacre had just begun. When the rain of projectiles ceased, the horns rumbled again with a call to charge. From the slopes and the cave itself, Pelayo's men launched themselves downhill. They were not a disciplined army, but a pack of wolves falling upon a disoriented flock, moving with the speed of one who knows every stone. In the center of the chaos, General Al-Qama and his personal guard were trying to create a point of resistance. They were veterans who formed a circle of shields, a desperate islet of order in the midst of the panic. This core became the epicenter of the battle, attracting the full impetus of the Asturian attack. The fight was brutal and hand-to-hand. The rebels did not have the armor or the swords of Toledo, but they fought with the fury of one who defends his home. And in the midst of that whirlwind of steel and screams, Al-Qama fell. We do not know if it was by a spear or the axe of a mountaineer. The only thing that matters is that his standard collapsed into the mud. The death of the leader was like turning off the light. For an army, losing the general is losing the brain, and the chain of command evaporated in an instant. There was no one left to give a coherent order. What followed was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. Discipline broke down completely, and the orderly retreat became a blind and desperate flight. Each soldier fought for his own life in a gorge that had become a death trap with no way out. The few who managed to escape the gorge did not find salvation. They only found a much larger trap, the Cantabrian mountains themselves. Without their general, wounded and seized by panic, the survivors were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting to get out of that green and gray labyrinth. Their instinct pushed them to look for the most direct route out of the mountains, a path that led them in the direction of the present-day comarca of Liébana. But it was treacherous terrain, full of goat paths and steep slopes, which was not made for an army in disarray. It was near a place called Cosgea where the tragedy became legend. The Christian chronicles describe it as the divine coup de grâce, the miracle that closed the story. While the fugitives were crossing a steep hillside, the entire mountain seemed to collapse on top of them. A massive landslide, what is known in the area as an argayo, buried almost all of them. For those who wrote the history afterward, there was no possible doubt. God or the Virgin had finished the work that Pelayo began in the cave, but was a miracle really necessary? Anyone who knows the Picos de Europa knows that its slopes are geologically very unstable. An argayo is a sadly common phenomenon. Now imagine hundreds of terrified men running without order on that same slope, probably soaked by the rain. The combined weight and vibration of their own desperate flight could have been the perfect trigger for the catastrophe. Sometimes, physics is as spectacular as any miracle. The result, in any case, was the same. The few who had survived the steel of the Astures were devoured by the earth. The punitive expedition had not been simply defeated. It had been wiped off the map. The message that would reach Cordoba, if it arrived at all, would be almost incomprehensible. In Dijon, Governor Munuza awaited news of an easy victory. He imagined Al-Qama returning with Pelayo in chains. What reached him, however, was not a messenger, but a handful of terrified survivors, men with a lost gaze, babbling an incredible story about collapsing mountains and an army that had disappeared. Panic seized Munuza. Suddenly, his garrison in Dijon was not a control post. It was an island surrounded by a sea of enraged enemies. The formidable expedition that was supposed to protect him had evaporated. He was alone, and he knew the mountaineers would come for him. There was no time for elaborate plans. The only option was to flee. Munuza gathered the men he had left and began a desperate retreat. His objective was to reach the plateau, cross the mountains, and get to safety in controlled territory. But Pelayo and his men were no longer the rebels hiding in a cave. Victory had transformed them. Now they were an army in pursuit. They came down from the mountains like a torrent, sniffing out the trail of the fugitives. The hunter had become the prey. The pursuit ended near a place called Olalis. There, the Asturians caught up to them. There were no longer any gorges or ambushes. It was a more direct combat, but the result was the same. Munuza's troops, demoralized and exhausted, were overwhelmed by the impetus of the victors of Covadonga. In the midst of the fight, Munuza himself was struck down. The man whose personal ambition had ignited the flame of war died in a chaotic retreat. With him, the last vestige of the Umayyad Caliphate's authority in the region disappeared. Asturias, de facto, was free. The small rebel ember now controlled the entire forest. With the echo of victory still resounding in the mountains, the warriors of Covadonga descended from the peaks. They were no longer a group of desperate fugitives. They were the founders of something new. Total victory had not only given them freedom, it had given them a future. That handful of rebels needed a structure, a visible head who was more than a military leader. In an improvised assembly, amidst the ruins of an old Roman settlement, they acclaimed Pelayo. The title of princeps was no longer enough. Now he was their king. The new monarchy needed a capital. Not a great city like Toledo, but a practical and defensible center of power. They chose Cangas de Onís. Do not imagine a palace. The first Asturian court was probably a collection of wooden and stone buildings, a modest church, and a hall where the king dispensed a rough and direct justice. It was a court of warriors, not of bureaucrats. The first institutions of the kingdom were based on the memory of Visigothic laws, but adapted to the harsh reality of the mountains. The objective was not to administer an empire, but to survive and, little by little, expand. The importance of this moment is impossible to exaggerate. For the first time since the invasion of 711, an independent and sovereign Christian political entity existed on the peninsula. It was not a mere rebel zone. It was a kingdom with a king, a capital, and the will to endure. They did not know it then, but in that small corner of Asturias, upon the foundations of victory, the seed of a process that would last more than 700 years had just been born. The first piece on the board of the Reconquista was placed. While in Cangas de Onís, the birth of a kingdom was being celebrated, in Cordoba silence reigned. Not a silence of mourning or rage. It was a much more insulting silence, that of indifference. The Arab chronicles of the time, so detailed for other campaigns, simply do not mention Covadonga. For the enormous power of the Umayyad Caliphate, the annihilation of a small expeditionary force in a distant and poor province was not news worthy of the great annals. It was a failure, yes, an annoyance, but not a strategic defeat. Centuries had to pass before a historian, Al-Makari, deigned to record the incident. And the way he did it says it all. He described Pelayo's rebellion as that of 30 wild donkeys who had taken refuge on a rock. According to him, the Caliphate's soldiers had them besieged until they died of hunger or fell to their deaths. In the end, only a few remained, surviving on honey that they found in the cracks of the rock. The chroniclers wondered what harm can they do. This view, although contemptuous, gives us the key to their perspective. For Cordoba, that had not been a battle. It had been a bandit control operation that had gone wrong. A very embarrassing one, no doubt, but nothing more. At that moment, the power of Al-Andalus was occupied with much more important matters. They were launching raids on the other side of the Pyrenees, into the heart of the kingdom of the Franks. Why would they worry about some stubborn mountaineers in a land with no economic value? Time, however, would eventually give them the answer. With each passing decade, that small nucleus of resistance not only survived, but expanded. The wild donkeys were building a kingdom. And only then, with the perspective of centuries, would the historians of Al-Andalus look back and realize that that forgotten incident in a cave had been the beginning of their end. One thing is a battle, with its mud, its blood, and its chaos. Quite another is the story that is told afterward, polished and brilliant like the blade of a ceremonial sword. For the kings who succeeded Pelayo, a simple victory in an ambush was not enough. They needed something bigger, something that would resonate through the centuries. They needed a miracle, and if they did not have one, they would build it. It was then that the chroniclers, especially those of the kingdom of Alfonso III, set to work. Their mission was not just to tell what happened. It was to give it a transcendental meaning. Covadonga ceased to be a brilliant skirmish to become the foundational act of a divine destiny. The victory no longer belonged to Pelayo and his men. It was a victory for God, who had chosen the Asturians as his new people to restore the faith on the peninsula. The miraculous details, such as the arrows that turned back, became irrefutable proof. The mountain that collapsed upon the enemies was not a geological coincidence, but the hand of Providence finishing the work. This narrative had a very clear political objective. It turned the kings of Asturias, and later those of Leon and Castile, into the legitimate heirs, not only of Pelayo, but of the old kingdom of Toledo. They were the chosen ones to restore what had been lost. Thus, Covadonga became the most powerful propaganda tool of the Middle Ages on the peninsula. It was the war cry that justified territorial expansion. It was the promise that, no matter how bad things got, the final victory was possible because God had willed it so. The historical Pelayo gave way to the legendary Pelayo, the first link in a chain that later kings would take care to connect seamlessly, all the way to a unified Spain. The real battle lasted a few hours. Its legend, however, forged a country for 770 years. If you travel to Covadonga today, you will not find a battlefield. Instead of the chaos and the screams, you will be greeted by the murmur of water falling from the mountain and a deep sense of peace. The setting of that desperate slaughter has been transformed into one of the most visited places in Spain. The heart of it all is still the cave, the Cova Dominica. Today it is known as the Holy Cave, a center of pilgrimage carved into the rock. There, next to a small altar, rest the remains attributed to Don Pelayo. The rebel leader rests forever in the same place that gave him the victory. But for most visitors, the true treasure of the cave is a small image of the Virgin with the Child. It is the Virgin of Covadonga, whom the Asturians affectionately call La Santina. She is the patron saint of Asturias, a cultural symbol that goes far beyond religion. She is the symbolic guardian of the mountain and its people. If you look up from the cave, you will see something that Pelayo could never have imagined. A monumental basilica of pink stone, built at the end of the 19th century, the Basilica of Santa Maria la Real de Covadonga. It is the definitive proof of how legend surpassed history. That victory of desperate guerrillas was now commemorated with a temple worthy of kings. And that is the secret of Covadonga today. It is not just a historical site, nor just a sanctuary. It is a place where the three things merge. It is the tomb of the first king, the home of the patron saint of a people, and the monument to the idea of a nation, a unique landscape where history, faith, and myth have been made into stone. And now, let us pause for a moment. What would have happened if Pelayo had lost? Probably, the rebellion would have been extinguished. Asturias would have been pacified, and history, as we know it, would be very different. Without that small nucleus of Christian power, the complete assimilation of the peninsula into Al-Andalus would have been almost inevitable. The true importance of Covadonga was not military. It was political. It allowed for the survival of a tiny sovereign entity, an ember that refused to go out in the middle of a forest that was already given up as burned. That small kingdom born in the mountains was the seed of everything that came after. It became the kingdom of Leon. From Leon, the county of Castile would be born, which later transformed into a kingdom of its own. And so, piece by piece, for centuries. The path that began in 722 in an Asturian gorge ended at the gates of Granada, a very long journey full of advances and retreats, of heroes and traitors, a process that forged the identity of the kingdoms that would eventually form Spain. That is why Covadonga is much more than a magnified skirmish. It's the demonstration that sometimes the smallest and most improbable acts of resistance are the ones that end up changing the world. It was not the end of the conquest, but it was, without any doubt, the beginning of its end. We hope you enjoyed this journey to the origins of the Reconquista. History is full of decisive moments, of small battles that end up changing the world, like the one at Covadonga. If you liked this documentary and want to continue discovering more fascinating stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit like to support us and activate the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for joining us.